whether we admit it or not, we all have our own ideas about what constitutes spiritual growth. We use these measures to measure others and also ourselves. And some people measure spiritual growth by the knowledge of the Bible and what it says about God. How well do they know it, how deeply they know it, and how well they're able to communicate that understanding to others. Another common way people measure spiritual growth was by their Christian activity. You know, the way they pray, the ministries they serve in, and how they served, or how regularly they attended church, or how they participated in gospel sharing activities and outreaches. But we know that relationships were at the very center of Jesus' teaching. Therefore, mature Christians should have healthy relationships. But over the years, I've kind of noticed that the measures of knowledge and activities do not necessarily translate in healthy relationships. So we begin to ask the question, how would Jesus measure our spiritual growth? I believe Jesus would measure our spiritual growth based on two commands rolled into one great commandment: to love God and to love people. You know, there's a reason that the two commands make up the great commandment, because you can't have one without the other. The great commandment is about relationships. It's about the quality and the breadth of our relationship. It's about the connections we have in life and how we connect with people in those relationships while simultaneously connecting with God. Now, if relationships were the most important thing to Jesus, then shouldn't we measure spiritual growth by looking at our relationships? Shouldn't we be looking at what kind of connections we have and what our connections with people are really like? If we don't value relationships we already have, if we don't invest and nurture them, they will suffer and die. Even relationships which were previously strong and had strong connections can falter without nurturing. We see it in people who struggle to say sorry, or others who carry unforgiveness in their hearts for years. Some who are really poor listeners, and some who would come across self-righteous, some who lacked awareness of the negative effects that we're having on the people around us. And we see those with repeating cycles of conflicts amongst their friendships and relationship networks. And sadly, we even see it in marriages, which were once strong, suddenly become dysfunctional and break down. In fact, if we to become mature sons and daughters of God, becoming better lovers of God and people, and if the fruit of the Spirit like gentleness, self-control, patience, kindness is bearing fruit in our life, then I believe Christians should have perhaps the highest EQ in the world, to have the greatest empathy and ability to identify with people. That's why one of our discipleship values is connecting. And we value connecting because Jesus connected with God and those near and far from God. John 3:16 reminds us that it was God's love for all mankind that drove him to send his Son, his one and only Son, Jesus, to die for us, to save us and restore us back into relationship with himself, but also with each other. We see this value working out in the life of Jesus. And we're going to look at how this value of connecting drove who Jesus connected with and how he connected with them in those relationships. Firstly, this value drove who Jesus connected with, where he put his priorities in his relationships. This value drove Jesus to live out his life connecting in three kinds of a relationship with God, those who are near to God, his disciples, and those who are far from God. Jesus maintained a balance of all three of these connections as he lived his entire life. We see this in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 to 19. Here in verse 12, we see Jesus connecting with God, and it says, "It was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God." And continuing in verse 13 and 16, we see Jesus connecting with his disciples. It says, "And when he came down, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he had named as apostles. Simon, who was also named Peter, Andrew, his brother James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who would become a traitor." And following in verse 17, we see Jesus connected with those far from God. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place, And there was a large crowd of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits being cured. And all the people were trying to touch him, for the power was coming from him and healing all of them. And my point is this: Jesus valued connecting, and it drove who he connected with. Having a balance of all three connections in his life is critical for spiritual growth. We don't grow spiritually well when we don't have a balance of all these three connections in our life. And I find more often than not that as a Christian we allow these relationships to fall out of balance. Spend most of our time connecting with only two of the three relationships. If we take a moment to reflect on your life, when you became a Christian, did you find over time that most of your connections are with God and other believers? Did you find that over time you began to lose connections with your non-Christian friends? I know I did. And when this happens, we can find ourselves becoming judgmental, sometimes self-righteous, sometimes feeling purposeless, almost like in a Christian bubble. Or what about some of us who serve? Do you find that you can spend most of your time connecting with other believers and those far from God, but neglecting your relationship with God? And when this happens, we can find serving others becoming burdensome and we lose that joy, or maybe even becoming burned out. Without an abiding connection with God, who is the source of living waters, we would become spiritually dry. There are others who've been Christians for over 10 years and they earnestly want to grow more. And they're doing it by having deeper biblical teaching. Yet in those 10 years, they really haven't connected with other believers and helped them grow in God. But yet discipling someone can do more for your spiritual growth than just acquiring more biblical knowledge. You see, we were created to connect in these three relationships. And when one is missing, the other two don't work as they should. Jesus modeled a balance of these three connections. And in the same way, we need a balance of these three connections to grow spiritually. But do you have a balance of all three connections in your life right now? Like, who are you connecting with? And if you look at the everyone in your life, who are you spending your time connecting with? Secondly, this value of connecting drove how Jesus connected in his relationship. Jesus would connect in his three relationships, and he would do it in a variety of different ways and methods. When he connected with God, there would be times when he would be alone by himself in solitude and prayer. But at other times he'd fast, and sometimes he would take his disciples aside and spend time with God together with them. You see, the value of connecting remained the same, but his method of connecting would change with different situations. When Jesus connected with those far from God in ways that were totally radical and different to the religious leaders of the day. In fact, the religious leaders would go to great lengths to disconnect them from those who were far from God. The leaders considered them religiously impure. Now contrast Jesus, who would go to parties with those who were far from God, show mercy instead of judgment. In some sense, the religious leaders were right with the truth, but yet wrong in how they were relating and connecting with those far from God. And this badly affected their ability to connect others to God. And this is the point. This value of connecting didn't just drive who Jesus connected with, but how he connected in his three relationships. And this is true for all of us. Being a disciple is more than just growing in our knowledge or our commitment to Christian activity, but it transforms how we connect in our relationships. It transforms how we are merciful to those who hurt us, kind to those who offend us, patient to those who are angry. It transforms how we are empathetic to those who are hurting, compassionate to those who are broken, truthful to those who need confronting. There's a verse in scripture that really captures this, and it's in 1 John 4:20, and it says, if someone says, I love God, but hates a Christian brother or sister, that person is a liar. For if you don't love people who you can see, how can you love God who you can't see? And if I could put it simply, how do I know if I'm growing spiritually in my love for God who I cannot see? It's found in how I connect and love people who I can see. This is the value of connecting that drives who we are connecting with and how we are connecting with people. Do you see this value of connecting driving your life? Do you have a balance of these three connections? And how are you connecting with people in those relationships? Let's explore together how this disciple-making value drives how we become disciples and build disciples who represent Jesus to everyone, everywhere, with everything.